Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming. Thank you, Holly. Thank you, Ellen. Thanks to all the volunteers here today. And thanks to Ron, Claire, and Lee, who are joining me on this panel. I'm going to do a brief intro, and then we're going to go into the questions, and we'll have time for Q&A with you all. So Ron has written over 20 books of fiction and poetry. He was a PEN/Faulkner finalist and New York Times bestselling author of Serena. The New York Times has called him one of the great American authors at work today. And John Grisham says of The Caretaker, with each Ron Rash story, you expect flawed people trying desperately to survive against the odds and a rich sense of place. What you don't always expect is a wicked plot. The Caretaker delivers all of the above in a story that becomes a race to the finish. Claire Lombardo is the New York Times bestselling author of The Most Fun We Ever Had, which has been optioned by Reese Witherspoon. The Washington Post says that Claire has such a fine eye for the weft and warp of families' fabric. And Bonnie Garmus, the best-selling author of Lessons in Chemistry, says the same as it ever was, witty and insightful, a powerful exploration of marriage, motherhood, and self. So those are our two authors. And now I'm going to introduce my friend Lee Boudreaux. We've worked together forever in publishing. She's going to kill me for this, but she is one of the greatest editors ever. And just proof of that, I'm going to read you a little sample of the list of books that she's edited in addition to Ron and Claire's. Bonnie Garmus's Lessons in Chemistry, Percival Everett's James, Madeline Miller's Song of Achilles and Circe, Andrew Sean Greer's Pulitzer Prize winner Less, Patrick DeWitt's Sisters Brothers, Kate Atkinson's Death at the Sign of the Rook, and Margaret Atwood's Burning Questions and her forthcoming memoir. So please welcome our panelists today. All right, so we're going to dive in. So Lee, if the writer is the engine of the publishing train, is it fair to say that the editor is a conductor, making sure everything's running on time and smoothly? So can you talk about the role of an editor?
Well, first let me say thank you all so much for having me here, and to the organizers. I'm so delighted. And, you know, having just sat through that panel on friendship, it's so much fun to be sitting here with these three. So Todd and I, he was a baby publicist when I was a baby editor. We were both kids from nowhere, like little teeny rural towns who found ourselves in New York, and so we just clung to each other and have been very good friends ever since. Truly, he's my office husband, and I go see him every day when I go into the office just to find out what's going on in the world. He is the best of the best. Ron and I have worked together since 2009, is that right? Serena was our first book together, but of course Ron was already a huge name, so I've been riding on his coattails forever. He totally gave me cred, especially with all the Southern booksellers, when I was trying to be like, no, really, read this galley I'm going to send you. It's like, I published Ron Rash. You can trust me. I have good taste, right? And then Claire and I, she was the first author I bought when I moved to Doubleday, which is where I am now. And this year I decided that publishing just wasn't as much fun as it used to be, so I've just gone on tour with her. She didn't invite me, I just volunteered. I was like, I'll go there with you, I'll go there with you. And then I was like, I'll go and I'll stay at your house with you. And again, I was not invited to do this. I was suddenly just like,
she was
no,
invited.
really. Ron and I spend a lot of our editorial time sharing pictures of snakes, because we both have a fascination with them, because who doesn't? And Claire and I, when we should be editing, talk about what color to paint bedroom. So it's very professional, all of these relationships. And then when I am wearing the professional hat, yes, I am the engine that keeps it all running. Todd, thanks for asking. The first thing you do is get a manuscript in that, with any luck, you love. And then you try to talk the people you work with into believing in it and trying to buy it, right? And sometimes you're the only one who's trying to buy something. And some of my favorite books and most successful books are books that no other editor was bidding on. And then other times, 10 other editors are going to bid on it, and you're going to end up in an auction, and this process is going to take days and days and days. And all sorts of other people get involved, like the sales team, what do they think of it? Or your boss's boss's boss, if it's going to go for a certain amount of money. Or if another imprint within your company also wants to bid on it, who's going to get to bid? So sometimes it can go easy, and sometimes it can go very long and drawn out. And then if you get to buy the book, you get to edit it. And that's my favorite part, because that's me getting to be the super fangirl. Imagine this. You read a book and you love it, and then you call up the author and you ask them all the questions that you just want to ask them. I mean, it is like the most privileged position. So then we get to do that for a couple months, and then you have to do all the publishing part of it, where it's like, here's your cover. Do you hate it? You do hate it. Let's try to get another. I now have to write the copy to describe your book. why don't you do that first, and then I'll tell you if you got it right or not. And I love it when people compliment me on the book copy, because I'm like, thank you. Of course I make the authors write it. I don't know how to make their book sound good. They're the ones, like, it has to have their DNA in it to, like, convey what the book is going to feel like. So then you put all those parts together, and then finally you get up to the pub date, and then a person like Todd, Doughty, a publicist, will take over, and then they, like, it really takes a village. Like, then the book has to go out there in the world, and you try to get the publicity, and you try to figure out where those readers are and how to get to them, like through the booksellers or advertising here, or what process you're going to work in all that white noise in the world. Like, how are they going to know a novel is coming out in, on the 15th of the month? So it takes a very long time, and you're meant to just kind of be overseeing it from beginning to end. Obviously, the editorial part is front-loaded, and then it turns into more of a project manager, where you're just trying to make sure, and sometimes you have to adjust, like, are we talking about this book the right way? Like, any book can be described any number of ways. So over the process, you're just trying to hone it, where you're like, oh, when I say this about the caretaker, people seem to really respond to it. So I'm going to stop talking about all that other stuff and just get to this, story of male friendship, or against the backdrop of the Korean War, or whatever part is kind of making it stand out a little bit more. But you have a lot of people helping you all along the way.
She's being modest. She's one of the best editors and presenters in the business. So one more question before we kick it open to the three of you. So Lee, how do you know when you're reading a submitted manuscript that it's the one? Is there like an editorial spidey sense, even if the book needs work? Like, how do you see it?
I would say, yeah. So you're just getting gajillions of submissions all the time, and they used to arrive in paper, and you would, like, carry a chunk home in a tote bag over your shoulder, which is why all editors have, like, bad rotary cuffs. And now, of course, we can load it all onto a device, which makes it even harder to find things, right? They all just get disappeared into this little flat screen. So I don't even read the cover letter that goes on them. I just dive in and read, and I don't know necessarily, I don't even remember what agent sent it, right? I'm just going straight into the manuscript. And what you want is something that just surprises you, and it's always with me, it's always like a sentence where it just did something I wasn't expecting. And there's a certain moment where you're like, oh, whatever this person is telling me, I don't know what the story is even about, I'm in because of the way they already have me, right? And it usually happens very soon, I mean, I remember the opening of Serena. It was just that insane scene on the train platform. Like, it started with a disemboweling, It was just like, all right, Mr. Rash, let's see where we're going to go with this. And then when I was reading Most Fun We Ever Had, which was Claire's debut novel, it's a family saga. It's going to describe nothing but the quotidian, right? It did not start with a disemboweling. That will be my editorial note on her third novel. What if we disembowel somebody first? And that's a very high bar. Like, how are you going to do just an everyday life in every family, And the opening was a family gathered around as a wedding was taking place, right? And you slowly centered in on the married couple who's been married for 40 years, their daughter's getting married, and they're standing under a ginkgo tree. And she had me. She did this, like, carousel around the yard, and suddenly you knew everybody in that room or in that setting, and what are all their stories? She just piqued my interest immediately. So yeah, it's the quality of the writing where they've done something with that language that I didn't expect to see happen.
All right, so let's talk a little bit about the three of you, or how you work together. So Ron and Claire, can you guys describe the editorial process of working with Lee? How did you shape the novel together? What kind of feedback were you looking for during the process? Anything else you want to bring up? So Ron, we'll start with you.
Well, I think start off with, I think Lee's the best editor in New York. I don't think there's any doubt about that. And what makes a really great editor, and she is it's kind of like what Maxwell Perkins had, but that she never wants to write her book. She wants to write your book. I mean, or really get inside your book, and she has that insight into what you are trying to do. That's pretty amazing talent, I think. I mean, there's a kind of artistry in that. But yeah, I mean, I think one good thing about Lee is that she's so sweet when she tells me the book is just hopeless right now. She always starts off deary, and but I think one thing you have to have with an editor's trust, and you know that she believes in you, but she also believes in the book. And I think that's really where, sometimes, with this last book was the hardest book I've ever written. I ended up writing over 1,000 pages, and the book's only 250. And I just kept getting it wrong, and, Lee just kept telling me that, and I knew it. I'd go pout a few days, almost gave up on it, and Lee didn't give up on it. My buddy Steve Yarbrough, whom I dedicated it to, didn't give up on it, but I did. I actually went and wrote a book in the Valley. I went and wrote some short stories and moved away from it. But I finally came back, and I think, we kind of worked together. I think what Lee understood was that the book was just like, this happens, this happens, this happens, this happens. And that it wasn't happening.
Claire, what about you?
Yeah, I will second or third or fourth what everyone has said. Lee is wonderful to work with. And I think it's probably not surprising you bring an enthusiasm, I think, to the work that you do that makes something that's pretty lonely and often pretty slow going seem really fun, which is deceptive in a really nice way. And so I also think that you have a very sort of intuitive, almost like musical ear for the way that stories unfold, and pacing, which is, as someone who writes novels that aren't heavily plotted, is really wonderful for me. But I think with Same as It Ever was my new novel, I had spent several years alone with this book during COVID with my dog in my house. And it was just such a joy to suddenly kind of have someone to have really long conversations. You talk about getting to ask the author all the questions that you want to ask. I have those questions too about my own book. And so I get to do that with you, and it's always really fun and enlightening and sort of like therapy, probably more than you would care for it to be. But
I have a question. Do y'all know what you expect when the manuscript first hits my desk? Like, do you have any idea what's coming back? Because I feel like when I'm editing, all I'm doing is kind of putting a little signpost there saying, this is what average reader is thinking is happening, but is that what you meant to have happen, or why am I getting it wrong, right? So, and then the writer usually knows that, but they just didn't, you'll need the signpost to be put there because you're just not sure, and you'll try to get away with it if you can, and then if the signpost gets stuck there, you're like, I knew that character wasn't working or whatever. So like, do y'all, when you send it off the first time, have an instinct about whether we're going to edit for another 3 months or 6 months or whatnot, or do you send it off just being like, that is perfect, I nailed it, I am done, and that thing's coming out in, I don't know, maybe 6 months, it's so tight?
Go ahead.
No is the short answer to that question. No, I think I think particularly with the second novel, I had a hard time writing my second novel, and did not think it was perfect. And I don't think I have ever written something and felt like this is done. I've published 2 novels and I've still not felt like, oh, I finished this thing. So no, I think maybe more with the second than the first. I didn't really have an idea of what needed to be done, or what you were going to come back with. I knew what it would look like to work with you, but not necessarily what would change.
I think, I felt pretty good about every novel. I mean, I knew it wasn't ready, but I felt pretty good except for The Caretaker. Mm-hmm. And when I sent it, I remember you telling me somebody had read it and said, I can't even figure out who the hell's in that cemetery, and I mean, it was kind of a mess, and I think we both knew it, and I knew it, but I knew also, we're going to talk a little bit, about kind of how the story began, but I felt like there was something there, and I thought you would see it. I hoped you would see it, because, I've been following Lee. I've been like a lonely dog just following her from publishing house to publishing house. She keeps, I think I kind of wonder, is she just trying to tell me something? Because, I go to, Harper, and then she leaves, and so I've just kind of been trailing her through the New York literature scene. But that book, I think, I knew that book was kind of a mess, but I felt like I wanted you to see it, yeah.
All right, so we're going to dive into the novels themselves. So, Ron, let's start with you. The Caretaker opens with this harrowing scene during the Korean War that serves as a catalyst for the rest of the events that unfold in this small North Carolina town between the soldier Jacob, his friend Blackburn, who is the caretaker of the local cemetery, and Jacob's wife, Naomi. So, twists and lies and the search for truth ensue. If you haven't read it yet, please get a copy today. It's 102 days till Christmas. And so, Ron, can you talk a little bit about the book itself and the inspiration?
Yeah. Well, I'm actually going to give a talk at North Carolina Writers Network conference in about a month, and I'm going to talk that the worst thing a writer can have is an idea. And the reason I say that is 35 years ago, a friend of mine told me a true story that took place in the Carolinas where a young man, he was 19 years old, and he had from a very prominent family in that community, and he ended up eloping with a 16-year-old hotel maid, and family was just outraged by this. He was drafted into World War II, and while he was gone, the family had her killed. Now, that's a true story, and I'd had that story in my head for 35 years, and I kept knowing there was a novel there, and then finally, I guess about 9 or 10 years ago, my novels always start with an image, and I had an image of a woman kneeling in front of a tombstone, and she was in mourning and veil, black clothing, and I didn't know. I thought it was the ghost of this woman because she's looking at her own name on the tombstone, and that's when I just started trying to jam this novel into that true story. And I'd forgotten one of the things I've always known. When you think, Faulkner, the worst book, or maybe you get past maybe the first two, a fable. Well, no, they're good, but I mean, a fable is his big flop. But the problem with that book, I think, is that Faulkner outlined it. You can go to his house and you'll see the whole outline. Sound and Fury starts with an image of a little girl climbing a tree to see her grandmother's funeral. And it just that idea of the image, and that really threw me off. And finally, it's when I realized, no, they're not going to kill her. They're just going to make it look like. And that's not giving away anything. That's just the first 30 pages. But
that's the setup, folks, and then it unfolds from there. Claire, same as it ever was, opens with a chance encounter at a suburban Chicago grocery store between your protagonist, Julia Ames, and a former friend of hers, Helen. And this accidental run-in is the catalyst for the rest of the events in your novel, which again, 102 Days to Christmas. You will happily pass along Claire's book and shove it into someone's hands and say, just read it and call me when you're done. Anyway, the book flashes back into Julia's past while we're in the present, and questions of motherhood and self-worth and the ups and downs of the marriage are throughout all of your beautiful books. So what was the inspiration for your novel?
That's a good question. I think the first scene in the novel is not the scene that I wrote first, but that relationship between this woman, Julia, who at the time is in her 30s at a very low point in her life, and then this woman, Helen, who is, 30 years her senior and appears to have it all together and have it all figured out. I was very, very interested in that dynamic. And so that sort of got me into the book. And then once I met Julia, the more, I don't know if it's that I got more interested in her or that she wouldn't leave me alone. It was some combination of the two. And so, yeah, it kind of just went from there. The fun thing about being a novelist is that you can sort of I'm a very nosy person in my normal day-to-day life, but there are limits to, like, you can't just go into people's houses if you don't know them. You're not supposed to be looking in their windows. But when you're writing a novel, you get to do all of those things and spend as much time in someone's house and in their head as you want. So Julia was very appealing to me in that sense. And so from there, 500 something pages later, here we are. Yeah.
Both The Caretaker and Same as It Ever Was have these multi-layered, brilliantly structured plots. They center on betrayal, secrets, familial strife, and then ultimately finding these measures of peace. Like, Lee, can you talk a little bit about those elements of surprise that clicked when you first read these two books a
I
little
think it's
bit?
amazing that novelists are capable of holding those cards close to their chest, saving those reveals for late in the book, and figuring out what little, clues to drop along the way and how to hide what needs to be hidden. So reading it the first time and having the surprises surprise you is one thing, and then when you go back to do the second pass or the third pass, and the knowledge is built in. You can't unread the novel. It's a very different process, and I think it's hard to weigh those things. Most novelists don't want to reveal too much, and I lean a little bit more heavily on the side of clarity, so there's always a tension there, and usually it's the writer saying, no, I don't want it to be clear right now, I'm saving that for later, and then I, yield to them. So my job is just kind of asking the question and trying to say, have we salted the story enough here, or have we lost track of it? That's often something you do in editing, is just like, we just haven't seen these people for a while, or we haven't heard about that, and I forgot that person was mad at that person, and we just need to build up that through line a little bit more. But Claire, I've done this with you. I've never done this with Ron. Like, when you're trying to keep all that straight in your head, like Claire does these enormous swaths of time, and she does present and past and alternates like that. And one time were trying to nail the plot sequence, and she had every character color coded, but also the time segment it happened in color coded, and she just had this massive wall behind her, and we just got on a Zoom call together, and it was like, but there's so much blue right there in the middle, and that was like too much of one character in one time period, and it was weird. Like, I'd never done anything that visual before, where by laying out this hugely complex thing, you could just see where you had too much of one thing in one place. And Ron, when you and I get into the plot, again, I'm probably, neither of these like to do plot a lot. They're all language writers, and then I come along to do the boring, like, but a thing has to happen after another thing happens. Do you end up, how do you keep it straight? Because like one of the things with the caretaker was like, who was in that grave, right? Like, we had this amazing
we need to
image
figure
of
that
a
out.
woman looking at her own name on the grave, and then we went through all sorts of like, but she ain't dead. What's happened, And then like part of it was also, in order to fool everybody, certain distances had to be kept, but it's a historical time period. You don't have cell phones, and you don't have this, and you don't have that. And I think a lot of novelists like setting things down before cell phones, because like GPS alone will ruin more plots than a library could keep track of, right? So like it's hard. That's one of the games. Editing is like just putting a puzzle together, right? And you guys have taken the first, second, third, fourth, fifth stab at it, and then the editor comes along just to be like, but wait a minute, if this is here, then that didn't make sense there, until you kind of smooth everything down. But the stories exist in your head more clearly than in anyone else, right? So those of us asking questions are kind of just pecking on the wall that you already understand how it's built, seems to be my sense.
Can you guys stick with that for a moment longer, which is kind of, just want to ask, like, for Claire and Ron, was there a moment during the process with Lee where you needed to crack something open that was not working, or like helped transition the book in a formative way? You talk about the woman in the grave, and how you'd put the novel away. So Ron, can we start with you?
Yeah, I think maybe the most important one came late. I mean, this was like after 7 or 8 years. And I think this is kind of was maybe in some ways the turning point. Two things. One, really working on the parents a little more, bringing them in.
Yeah.
But also having this moment where, I mean, in a way, the book, starting with that opening scene with Jacob, is about people being tested to their very core. Mm-hmm. And I had not done that for Blackburn Gant, who ultimately becomes, I think, the central character in the book. And there's a scene late in the book where, for the first time, he has this moment of real temptation, where he's going to have to go to the very core of who he is. And I think that's what we want to do as writers. We want to get we want to strip them down. We all have in real life and in art, and you want to strip them to the very essence. And I think it's that moment where I felt like this thing, and I remember you feeling that too, that, yeah, you got it now. That was kind of like the last thing we needed is to put him in that, because every other character in the book had kind of gone to that point.
Great. Claire, how about you?
I'm thinking of with Same as It Ever Was, I think the issue with both of my novels has been trying to figure out how to keep momentum going, even if there isn't like a big sort of overarching plot element. And with this last book, I remember us talking through the teenage daughter, how there wasn't a lot happening in the present arc, which was an issue that I faced in both of my novels. Um, and you and I sort of went back and forth of like, this is what you get to do as a fiction writer. Does she have a drug problem? Does she have an eating? Like, you just are sort of inflicting these like terrible things on this 17-year-old person who doesn't exist. And I think I tried that for a few weeks. I tried writing in sort of these more serious plot lines, and we ultimately reached the conclusion that like, no, it can't be something more serious because then it becomes a larger preoccupation of the novel. But that's a small example, I think, of I'm thinking of other collaborative creative relationships I've worked in, and you don't always feel, or I have not always felt comfortable saying the thing I'm thinking or being like, this is a really crazy idea, but and I feel that way with you, which I'm very, very grateful for. And so I think having the opportunity to kind of work through plot elements like that and say, this might be a terrible idea. Let's give this girl bulimia and see what happens. Is freeing in a sense, and does often yield. I think you have to try the wrong thing several times
Yeah.
often before you get to the thing that works. Yeah.
Well, both of your books are centered around family, and this is going to sound stupid, but I think it's a really good question in terms of how these books came about. Family being either biological or the families that we make. So, what is it for the two of you that make a family saga appealing? And Lee, what is it? What is appealing to you as an editor? Do you want to go first?
Um, well, like I said, there's no novel I am specifically looking for, and there's no novel that I wouldn't read. So it's all about somebody just arresting me on the page when I wasn't expecting it. Families, I mean, Ron's novel is about in a family, you know, members of a family deciding what's going to keep them together and what can't be born, and then other members of that family having to decide from their perspective what can't be born, and reshaping things accordingly with kind of everything on the line.
With
So
good
this,
intentions too,
yeah,
like they mean well, but horrible
horrible
happen.
things happen. So like the stakes are very high, and it is fascinating to watch people try to do what they think is right when they're not aware of the destruction they're about to bring about, right? And watching that happen and wondering who's going to kind of rise out of the rubble. So like the stakes there were very, very high from the get-go. And in Claire's novels, the first one had a set of 4 adult sisters. And the relationship between those 4 women was just fascinating. And I don't have a sister, and I've published a lot of novels that do have sisters in them, though, and I was thinking about this the other night. I was like, maybe I'm secretly fascinated with what that particular relationship is about because I've never had it. And I do think mother-daughter, female friendship. I loved Helen and Julia, that relationship, because it's about Julia looking at Helen as this aspirational figure, a woman in her 50s who has it all figured out, while Julia is a young mother who feels like it is all melting apart. And I immediately understood that, like those women we look to in life and are just like, how are you doing the thing you're doing? And what are the steps you took to get there? And then as the book began to be read and housed, women would come to me and say, I've got this really difficult relationship with my mother, and I knew exactly who that Helen person can be to somebody. Of course, what you find out is Helen may be unwittingly doing some destructive things of her own. So, I mean, families are where we all start from. They're what we're all, making every day of our lives. We're fighting to get away from every day of our lives, or contemplating what it would look like if it were perfect or better every day of our lives. So there's endless material there between those, the dynamics of a family and the sheer, the people you love the most can kind of shiv you the most, So again, you're just starting out with very high stakes, which as an editor I tend to like. I like the sharp contrast of what we're all in that novel fighting for or looking.
Claire, do you want to talk about family a little bit? Kind of how it's infused
Sure.
into your work?
Yeah, I think one of my favorite things to tell, I teach fiction writing in addition to writing it myself. And one of the things I tell my students if they are stuck in a story or a novel or whatever they're working on is to just stick the characters in a car together, because you can't get out without being injured or worse. And that's sort of how I feel about writing family. You are with these people for better or worse, and there are ways to extract yourself, but they're not clean. And it's not common. It's not common to like excommunicate yourself. I don't think. I don't know. Maybe tell me your stories. But I think I like the constraint of that. I love any constraint as a fiction writer because when you sit down to write a novel, there's infinite possibilities, infinite permutations, infinite ways to tell a story. So anything that can kind of be like, all right, we have to write within these parameters or follow these rules. And so I love that. I love the amount of drama and tension that can happen without having to leave a house or a living room or a car. And that's what I sort of salivate over when I'm reading, and it's what I love to do when I'm writing. So I think that's
why.
yeah.
Ron, what about you?
I think they pretty much nailed it.
Okay. All right, there we go. One last question on sort of the books themselves. Everybody goes into a bookstore and sees the jacket of a book, and I think it's an eternal question for those of us that work in publishing is like, how did that cover end up there for better or for worse? Can you guys talk a little bit about the jacket process?
Ron, would you like a rusty pickup truck on your next book?
Yeah.
He
Yeah.
asked me one time, he's like, the problem with being a Southern writer is I've got a chicken or a rusty car on every book I've ever done.
Yeah. After a while, okay, what cliche are we going after next? Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
hard. The cover process
Yeah.
is really hard. It's got to be excruciating for you all because all of a sudden somebody else shows you the face of your book as they see it, and it must be terrifying. I mean, I'm sure you've had those moments where you're like, "That's not it," and if that's what they think it is, wow, this just got real complicated.
Okay, well, this didn't happen at Doubleday, but at another publisher. So I had a book of short stories come out, and the cover was of a chicken. No, a live chicken. I mean, a chicken, illuminated chicken on a beach. And I write about the Appalachian Mountains. And then with The Caretaker, you remember that first cover, it looked like a vampire novel.
Oh yeah.
It really did.
Right, trying to do a cemetery,
Yeah.
something
Yeah.
cemeterial. I mean, it was very werewolfy. It was very Halloween-y.
Yeah.
It was like Ron Rash's ghost story.
Yeah. But we got a great cover.
Yeah.
But
But it can take a while.
Yeah. How about you? I mean, have you had gone through that process and
Or even foreign
been
editions?
horrified?
Oh God, foreign editions.
Oh God, don't get me started about British covers of American
We've
novels.
touched a nerve, folks.
Oh wait. But was it your French cover with the staircase?
With the legs,
Oh my
yes.
God. Okay, so her first novel, the most fun we ever had, kind of a perky title. And so the French cover, and again, this is the one with the 4 adult sisters and a family, and the French cover had a staircase, and it was clearly meant to be 4 sisters sitting with their legs hanging down, different levels, but you couldn't see their heads. So it was just these disembodied legs. It was like the most serial killer looking book you've ever seen. But like the French love Ron. I mean, he's like the Josephine Baker of novelists over there. I mean, just like they cannot get enough of him. You've got great French covers.
Well,
Yeah,
but I had my Serena and The Caretaker coming out in Russia in December, and the Serena cover's great, but I haven't shown you the Caretaker cover. It's in a cemetery, but it's like, look at this, gorgeous, like Fabio guy, and I mean, it looks like Wuthering Heights or something.
Oh, that's amazing.
And Blackburn, this is a guy whose half his face is paralyzed, and so they asked me what I thought of, and I said, well, I don't know the market over there, but this has nothing to do with my book. I sent that to Adam,
It is. It's a pretty harrowing process. I mean, it really is.
Yeah.
And you're up against the deadline. I mean, and the deadline is not when that book goes to print to go on sale in stores. The deadline is like when it needs to feed out into the world online, and for our sales reps to be able to look at it, to go to the bookstore and say, this is what Ron Rash's next book is like. And I mean, to state the obvious, covers are very important. So like and you've got to print galleys, and if you don't have a cover by the time you do that galley, then you end up doing all sorts of nonsense, but it'll look even more important if it's like a letter from me on the cover instead of the cover. Nobody wants that, actually. So yeah, that's one of the toughest things to get right. Like the writing the book, the editing the book, that can be done and dusted, and everybody had a great time, and then you start with the cover and it grinds to a halt. And you send it to booksellers and you're like, what do you think of this? They're like, you have got to be kidding.
That does happen. We're going to, in these last few moments before we kick it all to you guys, talk about a few personal things. This is not the grilling portion of the interview. Claire, you mentioned that you teach, and Ron, you teach as well. Can you both talk a little bit about what it's like to mentor a student, and then to have Lee as a mentor to you as your personal editor? Claire, you want to go first?
I was hoping you wouldn't say that. I wanted to think about it. Yes, I can go first. Sure. I think the biggest thing I have learned from teaching is that I don't teach full time. I need to say that first too, because I think if I did, I might have a different answer to this question. But it fortifies me to be able to. The thing that's lovely about teaching fiction writing is that I don't necessarily know any more about fiction writing than my students do. I know more than some of them do, but but not all of them. And often the problems that my students are working through, though they might not look like it on the surface, are problems that I have worked through in the past or am currently working through. So often I'll find myself really confidently telling a student what needs to, change about their work to make it better, and realize that I'm sort of talking to myself, which I love. And I think, gosh, I don't know. There's no greater gift. I remember when I started graduate school for fiction writing, one of my professors said, you will never again in your life have the generosity of 10 people sitting around devoting hours and hours and hours of time on a story that you wrote. And that's what it's like working with an editor. It's such a gift. It's such a gift to have someone who is so committed to the thing that you're working on and trying to get to know it as well as you do, and who has perspective on it that you can't, because when you're writing a novel, you are very, very, very claustrophobically close to it. So I think having that gift has, I think, made me a better teacher, because I think I don't know, I think it has sort of helped how I hone my own criticism, how I talk to my students, and give them practical advice, and which is all anyone wants to hear is, how do I fix my fiction?
Right.
In really simple terms, I like to be told, do things 1 through 10 and your fiction will be done.
Sure.
So I think that's, I don't know.
That
Yeah.
works.
Yeah.
Ron, what about you?
Well, I don't teach in an MFA program, but I do have students who I teach an advanced fiction class, and I think, the thing I was talking about with Lee earlier, just that being just careful not to try to write, the story you want, because you're Ron Rash story instead of their story. So trying to, to bring that out. What is it that's going to make their voice, their story unique? But I think the most important thing I do as a teacher is every class I bring in about 20 books of short stories. It's a short story class, and I just say, okay, Barry Hannah doesn't know a plot from his ass or whatever, but he knows how to write a sentence. Read this. Read him for sentences. Read this story by Edna O'Brien, because the last sentence is going to ripple back all through this story, the Connor girls. But I would just bring in these books, and I would just show them to them, and as I think we all know, the serious writers are all voracious readers. That's how you get good.
Yeah.
And so I think in some ways, two things I can do is try to figure out what they're trying to do, and also give them, enough books that they can read that they will learn. Because I think ultimately that's how you learn the most is through reading.
Claire, are there texts or stories, novels that you go to? Like, is there one or two, like Ron had just said, that you give to your students? It's kind of like, this is it?
Oh God, this is where I forgot I've ever read a story. Yes. What? Give me a second. God. Oh, The School. Bartholomew's The School. Has anyone read this? It's like a page-long story. I'm seeing a nod. It is a master class. I'm going to spoil it, not completely. It's essentially about this teacher who is teaching this classroom full of tiny children, and they keep getting this sort of succession of pets, and the pets keep dying. And it turns into this sort of like existential pondering on what death means and what life means, and then a hamster walks in. It's the weirdest story. And I believe the last line of the story is, and then the hamster walked in. And it's just, I mean, it's such a bizarre story. And it's a page long, and it's just a masterclass in plot, which I'm not good at teaching because I'm not good at writing it. But really, all you have to do to make plot happen is to kill someone or something. And then it just keeps getting worse and worse. That's one that I really love. Yeah.
I gotta look that up. Let's switch gears to beginnings. Lee, how did you get your start as an editor? What was your first publishing job?
Well, I had no idea how to get a job as an editor from my little bitty town, and so I moved down to Atlanta. I grew up in Virginia, went to college in Virginia, moved with a roommate from college down to Atlanta because I was like, well, that's a big enough city. They'll have some publishing there. And then one day I will get a job at Algonquin in North Carolina. Like that's the absolute dream. And so I went down to Atlanta and I worked in a couple bookstores, and then I heard about this thing called the Rash The Publishing course, and it was like this 6-week summer class, and I was like, ooh, I will figure out how to do that, and then I will come back and I will get my job at Algonquin. And so I went and did that 6-week class, and then I came back to Atlanta and I was like, I want to go to New York, but I didn't know how to do it. So I got my ex-boyfriend to sell my car for me, and I worked for the law firm where I'd been a paralegal before I took off to Atlanta, and I summarized depositions for them and lived on the floor with 3 boys that I had gone to the publishing course with. And so when I wrote my mother a letter to tell her that I was going to leave Atlanta, where I lived with my college roommate, in Buckhead, it was beautiful, and somebody's parents were, a mile away. When I wrote her a letter to say I'm going to move to New York with 3 22-year-old boys, she sent me back a postcard that just said, I suggest you check the Weather Channel to see if hell has indeed frozen over. So I moved up there, and I thought I was going to be home in about 2 years to go work at Algonquin. Like, again, that's as far as I ever, intended to get. And so I moved up there. My first job was at Doubleday, which is where I work now. So I started as an editorial assistant, and you just do that long thing where you're an editorial assistant, and you're an assistant editor, and then you're an associate editor, and then you're an editor, and then you're a senior editor. It just takes forever and ever. But I worked at a place that's really good at both, really good at nonfiction and focused a little less on fiction. And I kind of knew even early days, like I was only a fiction girl. So I just really didn't know if this was going to work. They told you all the time, like, you have to do like half and half because fiction is the hardest thing in the world to break out. Like it's all the publicity you could get on fiction is like reviews. You can't get somebody on NPR or on a TV show because what are you going to talk about? Like it's not tied into a real world event. So fiction really did seem like the crazy thing to invest in at that point. But I was like, I think this is all I'm ever going to be good at. So I got my first job at Doubleday, and then I just slogged it out years and years and years and years. And then the first book I bought that worked was Curtis Sittenfeld's Prep. And it was the book that no other editor read on. And then it just shot out like a cannon. So it was like my books that have done the best have been the ones that were like the ones you least expected, the ones that other people weren't bidding on, that nobody thought, like when I did Song of Achilles, everybody was like, well, who's going to read that? Nobody likes mythology. And it was like right before Percy Jackson books, like, totally made everybody read mythology again. So it's been a fun little, lesson in, I don't know, following your own interest. And I have no ability to guess what other readers will want at all. I am just deliciously average enough that if I like it, other people sometimes do too. That's my great strength.
Speaking of jackets, Prep had a very dark cover. Was that your belt that's on the cover, if I remember correctly?
It's
Do you remember
not
this
well,
cover? It's white and it's got the belt.
And it's still on there. It just hit its like 20th anniversary, and that cover has never changed. And it was okay. We couldn't get the cover right on that. And at one point, they had a person reclining on a hill. No, at one point there was a stone wall with a bronze plaque. Okay, and it said Prep on it. It meant to be like the stone walls around a very exclusive school. Well, the word Prep on this gray and brown thing looked like it was like a novel set in a prison. And like sometimes you look at a cover and you don't know you don't know what's not going to work until you see it. And like that title, for example, had to be treated a certain way or it wasn't going to read clearly. Do you remember the oh God, what was it? you were there at Random House with me, the Andre Leontali. He was
Yes.
writing his memoir. Okay, so he was writing a memoir about his grandmother who had been, the guiding force in his life, and it was going to be called Polish. And so the designer did a cover, and they showed it at a sales meeting, and the sales reps were like, he's Polish? I didn't know that. And you were like, right, that title is really just not going to work. It's not going to read correctly. So yeah, prep was a long one to get right.
That's
That was
right.
my first lesson in taking up for the author about a title as the publishing company tries to tell that author what the book needs to look like. And we do know a lot, right? We do sell tons and tons and tons of books, and it is invaluable to listen to all those sales reps who are out in the field come back and tell you something about a book you think you've got right when they're trying to tell you it's not right. But I also learned, like, the DNA of the writer has got to be represented on that cover.
Yeah.
And when we put all of our sort of collective wisdom behind, like, you can't possibly have a white cover, it'll never work. It's just like, that's not. And as soon as somebody does it well, it's going to work. We're all going to imitate that for the next decade. Hence, Ron gets his chick.
There you go. Ron and Claire, can you talk a little bit about your beginnings? Like, what was the first thing that you published as a writer?
I actually have an answer to this. The first, and I realized this at an event for Same as It Ever Was, which I've been telling people I've been working on for 5 years. The first short story I ever published was in 2013, and it was about Julia, who's the
Wow.
yeah, and it was sort of a like magical realist, which is not my wheelhouse if you have ever read anything I've written. But Helen was like maybe didn't exist, and it was a very weird story, but that was the first story I published. Yeah.
Where was it?
Oh God. It's some small magazine for an MFA program in Chicago.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Ron, what about you?
Yeah, the first poem I actually started in my 20s. I didn't, I was writing poetry and some short stories, but I got a poem in the Southern Humanities Review, and Rod Smith, R.T. Smith, who was a poet I admired, took it, and that meant a lot that, someone I'd been reading took a poem, and yeah, that, and that's it was such a funny time because this was, pre-internet, and you would send out these envelopes with your 3 or 4 poems, and then obsessively, watch for the, the mailman. I mean, it was really, I got where I knew the sound, I was like a dog, hearing, its master coming home. And, and then I'd pick up the envelope because you had to put in a self-addressed stuff, and I'd kind of feel like, did they take a couple or not, No, it was a sickness, but, yeah, but I just remember that, how obsessive that was. And Steve, didn't you have like 2 mailboxes or something? Yeah, okay. Yeah.
That's a rough mail day.
Yeah.
Last question before we kick it to you all. Can the 3 of you talk or name the first book as a child you fell in love with, and potentially why? I'll go first. Mine was I seriously remember my uncle giving me a hardcover copy of From the Mixed Up Files of Mrs. Basil E. Frankweiler. Swear to God, that is to this day why I moved to New York City. Yeah.
You asked me to think
Sorry,
about
this
in
is the
advance, and
grilling portion
don't.
of the
I'll
event.
go blank on
It's a
this.
great question.
Right, I remember my mother reading a lot of Greek myths to us, and I remember I had a great aunt, so I'm much older, who had been a librarian, and I remember she told me a fascinating story. I couldn't remember any of the details, but it was about a woman who walked at the blood owl, and I just always remember that detail. And then I got to high school and we read Macbeth, and I was like, oh my God, she was telling me Macbeth, which just goes to show, like, children can absorb so many stories at such a young age, and they stay with you. And then when Serena hit my desk, and we described Mrs. Serena herself as a Lady Macbeth character all the time, and it was like that was sticking with me. That was one of those things where I was like, ooh, what if I got to grow up a book that like had this element in it? And sure enough.
I think two, but Jack London,
Oh yeah.
Call of the Wild. I remember reading that. I think in the 4th grade. That book really struck me. That was maybe the first book that I really, consumed me. And also Poe. I think, and it's interesting, a friend of mine's just published a biography on Poe, Robert Morgan, really good poet himself, a great poet, actually. And I was talking to him, and I said, to really get Poe, you have to be really well read and really smart, or be a child.
Hmm.
I mean, it really, there's something about that.
Claire?
Oh God, I'm gonna give a really lowbrow answer. I have 3 older sisters, so I sort of inherited their library. The Babysitters Club books, I was obsessed with, and I think it's not surprising looking at what I write today and what I read today, because the Babysitters Club book, they weren't about anything. They were just about people, like sort of upper middle class people moving through the world. And I just loved them, and I've read a few recently, and they don't really hold up, but they were very important to me for a time. Yeah.
Hey, it just takes one book.
Right.
Somebody else who made a big influence on me was when I read Tom Wolfe for the first time, and I realized
Really?
how absolutely insane somebody could be on the page. That just like life coming through at full volume with all of it, like Reading the Right Stuff, or The Electric Light Acid Test was the first one I read, and that really was eye-opening. Like, oh, a book can be like this. And I read Fear of Flying too. I was like, damn, this ain't what we were reading in high school English class. I didn't know people could write books like this either.
Well, I remember when I was kind of a precocious reader, and when I was, I guess, 15, I just said, well, Crime and Punishment, that sounds good. And so I was reading it, as making a D in biology in the back of the room, and I came to that scene where Raskolnikov kills the pawnbroker and the sister, and that was like, I've said this before, but it's like I'd always entered books, but that book entered me, and I think that was the time that really made me want to write, because I just thought, I still marvel at this, that got splotches of ink can do this.
Mm-hmm. All right, we're going to bump the lights and answer a few questions. Nikki? Oh, God. They say that. Oh. I'll keep it brief. Thank you. Yes, I wrote a book called Little Pieces of Hope. It's a good bathroom book. It's also what I think. There we go. That's it. Thank you, Carol. It is basically what I call a daily devotional of delight. It is lists and prompts of different things that bring joy. And I think in a world that can be a hellscape every day, I probably shouldn't say that in a church, but I do think it can bring moments of levity. So. Oh, what? Well, this is about them, but the one thing that I will say is, Lee and I, as she mentioned, grew up in very rural areas, and I grew up in Carterville, Illinois. My family is still there, and every day in the summer I would go to the library. So I think, speaking to a room full of book nerds, as you all are, and I mean that in the most complimentary sense, that was a haven for me. And so to be up here today, to be able to do this every day in my life and work with people like Lee is actually like the greatest thing that I could ever imagine. And then the fact that it came true is a miracle. The fact that there's a book is a miracle. So.
Did you know you were going to be a writer, though?
No.
Was that always in the back of your mind?
No. It kind of came out of the pandemic. I was doing these things on Instagram, doing these lists of happy making things, and that's how it all took shape.
Because I could never be a writer. I could not. They are magical.
You would never do it?
No. Y'all are magical. And
They are
you
magical.
do things that are superhuman. And I don't know how I could not, for the life of me, do what they do. I can only enjoy the fruits of it. So that's why I was wondering if you had come to New York thinking one of these days I'm going to have a crack at it.
No, total fluke and luck. You, yes.
Woohoo. Also,
Everybody hear that?
So.
Okay. Who wants to jump in?
Ron, you do well with your covers, right? I mean, not your titles. I don't feel like we fiddle around a lot for that. I feel like they've all come to me with the title they ended up with.
Well, no, well, The Caretaker, actually, the title I had for like 5 or 6 years was the sun and the cross, because there's
okay,
the field
yeah.
font is a symbol
Yeah.
that can be seen as,
Okay,
it's a
that's
Christian
right, that's
symbol, but it can mean either the resurrection, the sun, or the cross, and that kind of fit the
Yeah.
character choice at the end of that
Yeah.
book. But it wasn't working, and then I just thought, The Caretaker.
Yeah.
I don't know when we made that switch, but I remember thinking, that's what this book's about.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
think that's when I had a better sense of Blackburn, that he was
Mhm.
going to be more the center.
Right. Claire's titles, on the other hand,
Nobody likes my original titles. It's fine.
No, what's funny, okay, so somebody in the sales force said, what's amazing about Claire is I feel like everybody really knows her name, like in the book community among booksellers. They don't even need to latch onto a specific title, but everybody knows Claire Lombardo. I was like, that's because we keep coming up with 19-word titles to give y'all. Claire Lombardo has become much easier to remember than the titles. Okay, so the first one was called what?
The first one was called The Year We Were Born.
Yeah, and then it was a last minute thing that we just pawed through the pages and came up with phrases.
Yep.
And there's a great moment in there where somebody says, tell her she was the most fun I ever had. And then it was my boss who said, let's call it the most fun we ever had. That's much more inclusive. I was like, oh, that's so stupid. It's not what it says in the box. And then I was like, okay, you totally have a point. I'm glad we did that. And then this one was after a Bee Gees song originally, which
It was. Oh, God.
The
World
Ship-
of Fools.
World of
Not
Fools.
Ship of Fools.
Can you sing it for us?
And we changed
No,
it.
I
Well, everybody's going to be having it
It's
in your
going to
head
be,
for the rest
yeah,
of the
you're
day.
welcome.
But we changed it because I kept misremembering World of Fools for Ship of Fools, and I just thought, okay, it's not a good sign if the first person who needs to remember this is always just kind of one word off. It just wasn't sticking enough, and you go into these things thinking, surely it's going to be so easy to find a better title, and I've had many books that we went all around the house and back again and came back to the original title because we didn't find anything that was stickier.
But when you read Same as It Ever Was, when you finish it, you're going to be blown away. But then you listen to the Talking Heads song, and it's this weird sort of meta connection. It's kind of amazing.
And it was funny because there's a ton of music in the book, and
Yeah.
we just
Yeah.
went through and just kind of grabbed, like things that are good for titles: the Bible, Shakespeare, and song lyrics. But it was like, so it's got to be there, but
Somewhere.
it took a minute.
It took a while.
All right, we got one more. Yes, you please.
Mhm. Well, I think I didn't know how it was going to end, and actually, I envisioned all sorts of endings, and I think that's probably a good thing, because it's good for the reader. And I think that the ending of that book, Lee and I were talking about this earlier. Robert Frost said, "No surprise in the writer, no surprise in the reader," and the ending. At least the last 20 pages came late, and they were a surprise. And I think that's just one of the wonderful things that when you work on a book long enough, that you start to realize certain things that, and the other thing that I really kind of got interested in more and more as I got into the book was setting it in 1951 really allowed me that all of the interactions were face to face, and that's so much more dramatic. To have somebody lying, looking you right in the eyes.
After a 9-hour drive.
Yeah, and I mean, just, I really thought that's a really kind of a gift, to really have that kind of where every interaction is going to be like that.
Well, that's a wrap, folks. Thank you all for coming today. Thank you, Ron, Claire, and Lee.